Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. This is the second session of the sixth topic of the semester titled Modernization in Latin America, Russia, and China. All right, so now we're going to continue looking at modernization in Latin America. Again, this is something that we started in session one when we were looking at a series of changes taking place in the colonial period. It is really before independence that Latin America was moving gradually towards a market economy, very gradually, with, again, a series of changes that transpired since the 1650 onwards when the population growth. There's an increase in population. The indigenous population is also recovering. We see mixed groups, for example, what you call mestizos and mulattoes, etc. And again, this is going to push the colonies, the Spanish colonies, towards a market economy because the colonists really required essential items for their daily activities. And again, this is really leading to new enterprises like the commercial hacienda we talked about. We're going to see the rise of shops as well, cattle ranching, and this is really creating not only a market economy, but also an entrepreneurial class and also a middle class of sorts as well. And then we looked also at the Bourbon reforms. There's a change in the colonial administration of Spain in the early 1700s, and the Bourbons are modernizers, so to speak. They really want to increase productivity in the colonies, and they're reforming the economy, trying to make it more productive for exports. And so again, we were looking at that as well, how they're privatizing Indian lands, indigenous land holdings, and putting it on the market, and allowing private investors to develop mercantile haciendas to produce things like cotton, for example, sugar, henequen, and other products for exports for the mother country, for Spain. And so this is really going to lead to a series of changes in Spanish America that are going to, at the same time that is really developing the kind of the early stages of capitalism, they're going to really push the colonies towards independence. So let us look at our outline here so we can continue looking at this process. We see, of course, the Creoles, those are Spaniards born in America, really on the ascendancy. They're becoming really very productive, and they're in charge of the economy, so to speak. They own the most important enterprises in the colonial world, and they're the ones that are going to be pushing the colonies towards independence. And one of the main reasons has to do with the lack of political power. The criollos, as they were called, or the Creoles, are in charge of the economy. They own the haciendas. They're the major exporters of products to the mother country. They are handling the mines and the cattle ranches, etc. But they don't have a say in the political system. The ones that are in charge of the political systems are Spaniards born in Spain. They were known as the Peninsulars. Again, so this is going to really set the stage for the independence movements, the struggle for power, so to speak. Again, this is something that started back in the 1700s, but by 1810, this struggle between Spaniards born in Spain, known as the Peninsulars, who were in charge of the government of the colonies and also the highest position of the church, and the Creoles or the Criollos, who were really just in charge of the economy. This is going to really produce a clash, if you will, over power. And mainly what the Creoles resent is the fact that, they are the ones that are being taxed the most. They're carrying most of the taxes because they're the wealthy class. In other words, really, they're the kind of the prototype of a capitalist class, so to speak. They're the entrepreneurs. So taxes fall very heavily on them. And at the same time, they don't have political power when it comes to taxes, for example, or controlling their own provinces, setting up legislation and the like. And this is something that they really like. They would like to see a change in that direction. Now, of course, the masses, those that do not have economic power, particularly the so-called mixed races, for example, or the indigenous populations, they are the ones also quite suffering from Spanish policies, in that they're losing lands, for example. They are being displaced from their land holdings in order to turn those lands into commercial mercantile haciendas, for example, what we call plantations, for example. In Spanish America, the mercantile hacienda was more like a plantation. And they're the ones that, because they're dispossessed of their lands, they have no other option but to work for the new landowner, providing tribute for that individual. Again, so they are pretty much also bearing the burden of the new colonial policy set up by the Bourbons, and this is going to ignite, again, the process of independence. There'll be an alliance between the Creoles and the indigenous masses, or the mixed races as well. They're going to come together and oust the Peninsulars' grip on power. They're going to declare independence from Spain in the process. And of course, this is something that spanned between 1810 and 1824. Again, the independence movements of what is called Spanish America. And by 1824, the struggle was completed. The Creoles, who were the leaders of those revolutions, ended up succeeding in freeing themselves from Spain. Spain recognized their independence. And now, starting around 1824 onwards, they're beginning to establish a series of new countries or new republics, meaning that they are really modeling their countries on the model of the United States, with a federalist system of government, a distribution of power between the local towns, the states, and the national government, for example, granting each level a certain degree of independence. And of course, dividing the national government also into three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. So we have a similar system of government established in a series of Latin American republics. Again, you can see in this map all of the Latin American republics that were established with the revolutions that started in 1810. And once again, what should be noted here is that those republics were not really democracies. There was only a handful of people that received the franchise, that had the right to vote, and those were really property owners. Again, so the vast majority of the masses were not really participating in popular elections, for example. So again, it is perhaps a step in the right direction of trying to create a liberal democracy, trying to create the modern nation state based on representative government. But the truth is that only males and those that had wealth and property were the ones participating in this process, which really constituted a small minority. And really, it really belonged to the Creole class, the Creoles. Again, those were Spaniards born in America that are now in charge of the Latin American countries that they created out of the revolution, in other words. So they won the revolution, and now they're leading the new countries, again, that they have established. They create a series of countries, Mexico, for example, which really included parts of North America, what today is the American Southwest. Also Central America initially was part of that new country of Mexico. And of course, a series of South American republics as well. As I mentioned, again, they had limited franchise, as I mentioned. Now, as soon as those countries were established, starting around 1821, 1824 onwards, again, those countries had yet another challenge, and the other challenge was modernizing. In other words, yes, they had established perhaps the very first structures for a liberal system of government, although quite limited, of course. But when it came to the economy, those countries also faced the question as to what kind of economic system are we going to implement? Are we going to stay with the old feudal system that Spain had implemented, for example, in earlier times, or are we going to be moving on into a new time, a new system that will be more consistent with the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment? Again, we mentioned that in session 1 with Adam Smith, for example, creating a liberal economy or capitalism in that regard to achieve economic development or economic growth. Again, this is something that the creoles are debating. Now, the challenge of modernization was manifold because the creoles are dealing with a series of problems, in the new countries. For example, in the revolutions that they fought to win independence, the Spanish royal forces destroyed many haciendas and also mines. They were ravaged, in other words. So even those enterprises that had given a new life to the colonies in the past were in many cases disrupted. So they needed to recover before they will build a new system. So again, they had that challenge. And of course, the other challenge is that there is significant political instability due to the fact that in the past, what really kept the colonies, quote unquote, stable was the fact that the monarch, the Spanish king, was the one keeping the colonies together. I mean, he was the ultimate kind of father figure in this old feudal system in which all parties, all members of the different castes that we talked about, the peninsulars, the creoles, the mixed races, the indigenous peoples, etc., all of them appealed to the king for protection, and the king had to negotiate with each one of them different set of deals to keep, again, the colonies pretty much in place and stable, sometimes pitting one group against the other. That was another strategy as well. Now that the monarchy was gone, now the new countries are facing significant disruptions, political, in that there's intense competition over territorial boundaries, for example, which group is going to dominate and so on. So there's a lot of infighting, in other words, now, because there's no mediator, there's no monarch to intervene on their behalf to maintain order. And this led, for example, to the collapse of a large republic that had been formed in 1821 when in South America, Simón Bolívar, as he was known, who was really the leader of the South American independence movement, Simón Bolívar, created a very large republic that encompassed what today are the countries of Venezuela, for example, Panama, Colombia, and Ecuador, for example, parts of northern Peru as well. It was a large republic, just like Mexico was a gigantic republic as well. So as soon as independence was won, this republic was really disintegrated. It was broken up. And what we see is the division of this republic into a series of different countries, like the countries I just mentioned, for example. So we see indeed a gradual disintegration again of the new nations into smaller nations out of the chaos that came out of independence. And of course, the Central American region is also disintegrating and is separating from the larger country of Mexico. Remember that Mexico encompassed a vast territory that included Central America as well. Initially, that was part of Mexico. And what we see is, with the absence also of the monarchy, what we see is this disintegration also of the Mexican republic, in that the Central American regions controlled by different landlords and landowners. There were just power brokers, strongmen, if you will, in each region, were asserting their own power and separating pretty much from Mexico and creating their own countries like Guatemala, for example, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and so on. Again, they used to belong to Mexico. And now they're pretty much setting up their own independent state. So that revealed a certain degree of instability in the new Latin American nations. So again, this is going to be a challenge, as we'll see, because number three, the leadership. I mean, those were the leaders of the revolution that are now in charge of the new countries that are formed in Latin America. They're also dividing themselves. There's going to be a split in the Creole leadership between two different schools of thought, or two different ideological camps. On one hand, we have the liberals, and the other, of course, the conservatives. In those ideological camps were groups that had different visions for the future of Latin America. In each country, again, what we see is that each country, as they're trying to modernize their economy, they're going to split into different ways of how to achieve modernity, how to move forward and create a modern economy, okay, to achieve what is called economic development or economic growth. The liberals were really looking after the United States and Great Britain as a model. They really wanted to implement capitalism. In other words, free up the economy, to liberate the economy from state control, pretty much move to the market as a whole. Everything, again, within the economy has to be moving towards the market, what this is called free market. Land holdings, for example, the land has to be put on the market to make it more productive. We have to allow individuals to create all kinds of enterprises, businesses, unrestricted. So we will generate massive amounts of goods, products, commodities, particularly for exports, and in that way create a national economy based on growth, on economic growth. And that, again, this is going to lead to the creation of a middle class as well. And this is what they're actually looking after. That entails, of course, bringing in railroads and technologies, perhaps even industries. Again, the liberals are pretty much fixated on that idea. And of course, the other idea is secularism. The liberals tend to be very, very wary of the Catholic Church, the undue influence and power of the Catholic Church, this Spanish institution. This is the legacy of the old feudal order. And they want that influence to be significantly diminished. They want to remove the church from politics, from the legal system, but more importantly, they want to remove the power of the church in education. They want education to be scientific. In other words, to train the new generations with the new scientific ideas of the Enlightenment, to prepare them for a technological future, in other words. And they see really the church as an obstacle in that direction. Now, the conservatives, on the other hand, really look at Spain as a model for development. They're really also interested in achieving economic development. They don't want stagnation. They don't want the economy to stay pretty much, in the past. They want to move the country forward as well. However, the conservatives prefer to modernize much more gradually, in a slow pace and rhythm. They don't want to push radical change into their own societies, because they saw that radical change will simply cause disruption and instability and chaos, in other words. So they will like to preserve certain traditions, for example, the way people live, the Spanish language, for example, Catholicism as well. And also, within the conservative camp stood the popular classes, the indigenous population, for example, in Latin America, the what you call the lower classes as well, they often, from a cultural perspective, tended to be also more conservative because they also prefer to preserve their livelihood centered on the countryside. Again, this is a rural society still, up to this time. Most people live in the countryside in Latin America. And people will like to continue that kind of livelihood, living in the countryside, growing crops, for example, living in small villages and towns in a very conservative way, following their religious celebrations and fiestas and the like, again, honoring their ancestors, their customs, and the like. Again, so whether we're talking about large landowners, again, or the popular classes, both together prefer a more gradual modernization project, if you will, that will, on one hand, preserve the power of the Catholic Church. Conservatives are very much open to say that they will not like to see the power of the church being diminished because they see the Catholic Church playing a key role as a social control mechanism. In other words, maintaining order and stability in society, because the church is the one that actually convinces people that is God's will to obey their betters, for people to obey their betters, to obey their landlords, to obey the religious authorities, for example, the landowners, that God had created the social order as a hierarchy. And people should know their place, and it is okay to live, in the countryside as a peasant, growing crops, paying tribute to a landlord or to a religious figure, because this is the way that God had organized the world, in other words. So what they see is that the Catholic Church really serves a political function in keeping society, pretty much in order. Okay, so they want to protect the church. There's also, again, this idea of trying to preserve the traditional methods of farming. And again, most of the peasantry in Latin America are still growing their own food. Even though they have to pay tribute to a landlord, they're still allowed to control their own land, grow their own crops, and sustain their communities by growing their own food. And by doing that, they have a certain degree of cultural independence. They preserve their culture, their identity, because they are not relying on anybody else to sustain themselves. Again, so this is the conservative view as well, that they will like to preserve the traditional methods of farming. So again, they're not going to agree with the liberal idea of introducing, for example, capitalism, this idea of establishing commercial enterprises, for example, in which we see large landowners trying to maximize output, trying to grow cash crops for exports, which creates pretty much exploitation. Again, so the conservatives, again, in Latin America don't want that. They are indeed exploiting the masses. The conservatives, indeed participate in exploitation. Okay, they are indeed themselves landowners, and they demand tribute from the peasantry and from the lower classes at large. But they prefer to keep the traditional methods, the traditional forms of tribute or exploitation, rather than introducing new ones. In other words, rather than introducing, for example, wage labor, again, which is central to capitalism. They see that wage labor might aggravate the workers, because wages have to be kept low, for example, below subsistence level. And that can create, of course, resentment and anger, and that can lead to workers' unrest and eventually to revolutions. So they prefer the traditional methods of exploitation that require people to work on the land of the landlord a day or two out of the week to provide tribute and nothing else. Again, that's the traditional method, in other words. So they're engaged in exploitation, but it's not the kind of exploitation that the liberals are proposing to introduce. Now, after 1824, we're going to see the first wave of modernization taking place. Okay, this is a very unstable time. It should be noted. Again, from 1824, let us just say to 1870. Latin America really was a hotspot in the planet in terms of each country experiencing instability, coups, for example. No president was in office for very long. Sometimes presidents lasted a year, sometimes a couple of years before that president was ousted from power by the other party. This is, again, the fighting between liberals and conservatives. They're pretty much overthrowing each other at every turn because they're trying to seize the reins of the state in order to pretty much push the project of modernization forward according to their own ideology. Again, so there's a lot of infighting. There are civil wars and in coups as well, military coups, political coups, etc. taking place. Despite that instability, however, the liberals are able to some degree to push certain reforms during this time. So from 1824 to the 1870s, what we see is the first attempt by the liberals to start moving Latin America towards modernity. Again, and that push, again, was an uphill battle, so to speak, because, again, of the infighting that I just explained. However, when the liberals were in office, anywhere in Latin America, the first order of business was to start really privatizing the village land holdings. Again, this is really their first goal, to start really putting the land on the market. So they're going against the church because the church is a major landholder in Latin America, and within the church land holdings stood the village land holdings as well. So in order to privatize the land holdings, they needed to seize, confiscate lands from both the church and the village. And again, this is one of the major reforms that are taking place. What they want is to put the land on the market in order to create new haciendas, cattle ranches, etc. for exports. Again, to export cattle, to export leather, to export cash crops, a wide variety of different cash crops out into the world. However, despite the fact that they're able to push some of those reforms forward, they're going to encounter significant resistance. Okay, significant, I should say, popular resistance. The indigenous populations and the lower classes are going to be up in arms against the liberals. And here we see a phenomenon taking place known as caudillismo. Caudillismo is nothing other than a strong man seizing power in order to appear before the masses as the protector of the people, in trying to stall the liberal project, trying to halt the privatization of church lands or village lands and so on, and trying to appeal to the masses in that regard. Those are, again, strong men that are charismatic and have a large following of people. Some of them are conservative, some might be liberal. It really didn't matter. What the masses wanted was a strong man that will protect their lands, their livelihood, and their traditions. So this is a phenomenon during this first wave of modernization, again, in Latin America. So just to give you a few examples of caudillismo, of strongmen coming in and pretty much seizing control of a nation and trying to pretty much appeal to the masses, again, as the protector of the people, is a kind of very feudalistic kind of, political practice that really goes back in time in European history to the times of feudalism. We see, for example, in Argentina, Juan Manuel de Rosas, who really seized control of that country from 1829 to 1852, in the city of Buenos Aires, for example, which was really the capital city, around that city stood a large domain, this federal district, for example, that really constituted what the country of Argentina came to be known in the 19th century, early 19th century. Now, around the federal district stood a wide range in which cattle was produced in mass, and what the Argentinian so-called cowboys were doing during this time, which really were considered to be nomadic individuals of the lower classes of Argentina, the gauchos. This is the equivalent of the Argentinian cowboy, for example. They were nomadic. They were moved into the pampas, and they were to chase and hunt and round up the cattle in order to feed the country. Again, so they played a key role in the national economy of Argentina. But again, this is not really the kind of modern system of cattle ranching by any means. This is a very, very unsophisticated type of cattle ranching in which, again, this is not really a ranch at all. This is just an open range when people were just grazing cattle. It was in the wild, and the gauchos were nomads. They lived in the wild, and they were just rounding up the cattle and so on. Now, the gauchos, of course, are seen in Argentina as the lower classes, so to speak, in which they are kind of ostracized and marginalized by the liberal elites of Buenos Aires. They're looked down upon, in other words, that they're really, again, just, nomads, migrants, filthy and very violent individuals that engage in fighting, etc. Again, and they're being threatened by the liberals as the liberals are trying to introduce a new system of cattle ranching, fences, for example, barbed wire, and trying to graze, certain kinds of cattle and build slaughterhouses and so on to export leather and beef and the like. So they want to introduce new methods. And so what they want to do is to do away with the gauchos, in other words. So the gauchos appeal to a strong man. And so what we see is the arrival of Rosas here as the caudillo, the strong man, in other words. He is now rising up to national politics. He seizes control of the country, and he becomes really the protector of the gauchos, trying to protect that traditional livelihood, protect them, and he seizes power and becomes a sort of kind of caudillo, meaning a dictator, in other words, of Argentina, opposing modernization, opposing the introduction of modern cattle ranching in Argentina, and he receives the support of the popular classes, not only the gauchos, but the poor in general, the downtrodden, for example, the people that feel exploited are going to become part and parcel of his political base, and this is how he consolidates power, and the liberal project is really stalled for a number of years. In Guatemala, we see something similar when the liberals, for example, come into the country of Guatemala. They're beginning to privatize peasant lands right and left in order to foster the formation of commercial agriculture in the country. They're engaging in massive public works projects to upgrade the transportation system of the country, trying to build, roads and ports and the like, because they're trying to export those products, again, overseas. And they're introducing wage labor. Again, so as they're dispossessing peasants from their lands, they're introducing a new system of labor and based on wages. And in many cases, they're using the state to push people into those public works projects, using what is called labor drafts as well, and pretty much forcing the landless peasants to work for the state, building roads and clearing land and modernizing the ports and the like. So obviously, there's going to be a sector of population that will be very disaffected, and they are now throwing their lot, so to speak, to a strongman, a caudillo, by the name of Rafael Carrera, who seizes power in 1839 and will rule the country in a kind of dictatorship, so to speak, way until his death in 1865. Again, so his main supporters are the indigenous peasants who had been dispossessed, the Catholic Church, because it also was the target of the privatization schemes of the liberals, and of course the conservative landowners. So again, this is a coalition of forces, all of whom are considered conservatives. They have different class interests, but nonetheless, what brings them together is this idea that they want, again, to keep the traditional system of the past, gradual modernization and preserving their land holdings and, of course, their power as well. Again, this idea is, to resist the liberal project altogether. In Mexico, we see something similar. We see a series of liberal reforms that initiate in the 1850s. This is a period in time in Mexico known as La Reforma, the reforms, in other words. The leader of the liberals is Benito Juarez, who seizes power in 1858, and he's going to be in charge of trying to modernize Mexico very rapidly. And his main target is the Catholic Church, by the way. Okay, so he really wants to implement capitalism in the country. And so he sees the Catholic Church as an obstacle because the church really was a great landowner in Mexico. Anywhere between 30 to 50% of all the land of Mexico was in the hands of the church. So, of course, he wants to liberate Mexico from this old system. So he introduces a piece of legislation known as Ley Lerdo, for example, to privatize the church lands, which included village land holdings as well, which the peasants, the indigenous peasants, control. So this is going to elicit, of course, popular resistance as well. And what we're going to see across Mexico is that the peasantry will be allying themselves with local caudillos. Those were really just strongmen that control certain provinces of Mexico. And they will become the so-called protectors of the people in terms of trying to resist Juarez, to resist the liberals, this assault on the Catholic Church and village land holdings. And when they were not able to combat the liberal regime, they requested the assistance of a foreign power. The conservative landowners and the church went to Europe really to invite an imperial force, in this case France, to invade Mexico, to turn Mexico into a French colony for the sole purpose of protecting the conservatives, the large landowners, the Catholic Church, and the like. Again, so we see this process known as the French intervention from 1862 to 67, which was really, again, the invitation of the conservatives to a foreign power to stall the liberal project, again, to halt modernization in Mexico. Again, so it was short-lived, the intervention, but nonetheless is significant, again, that the conservatives were going at great lengths trying to stop liberalism in Mexico. Then we see a second attempt at modernization. Starting around the 1870s, after a series of infighting, civil wars, and coups that plagued Latin America, what we see is that the liberals ended up winning the fight. And in many cases, they won the fight not necessarily by crushing the opposition, but by convincing the opposition that liberalism was the way to go. So by the 1870s onwards, liberals and conservatives are kind of coming together and they're blending by this time. In other words, conservatives are now joining the liberal camp. In other words, so this is the so-called triumph of the liberals, and what we see is a second wave of modernization from the 1870s all the way to 1900. Now the liberals are in charge. They have more stable governments, more stable regimes, and they're going to start pushing the process of modernization even further at a higher rate, faster than ever, in other words, because there's really little opposition now by this time. For example, in Guatemala, what we see is a liberal regime headed by Justo Rufino Barrios, who governed Guatemala from 1873 to 1885. And he really turns the entire national economy geared for exports. Again, now this is the idea. Okay, so the realization is we're not going to industrialize anytime soon. We're not going to have factories, in other words, industrial plants and the like. But our greatest asset, of course, is the land itself. We have a very productive agricultural sector, and we're going to turn it outwards. We're going to maximize our exports to bring in capital, in other words, from the outside. So again, Guatemala is just an example of the rest of Latin America, how Latin America is moving towards exports at this point. Again, and the idea is to commercialize agriculture through and through, to create more and more plantations and commercial haciendas geared for exports. In the case of Guatemala, they started with coffee. Later on in the early 20th century, they're going to be moving towards fruits as well, like the bananas, for example, and so on. Tropical fruits. So again, they start with coffee. It's a major, major cash crop, again, that is valuable in the global market, in the global economy. So besides the introduction of an export-led economy with commercial agriculture, also Barrios is trying to modernize the transportation systems of Guatemala, trying to pursue this, path of public works projects and trying to improve roads, ports, and also railroads as well. Again, trying to build railroads to, of course, ship the cash crops to the major ports, and that will be moving out into the global economy. Again, so they need it, again, that infrastructure as well. Now, because by this time the Catholic Church was largely diminished at this point, the Catholic Church was now be driven out of politics in many regards, out of the judicial system and also the education system. What the liberals realized is that the conservatives were not really wrong in thinking that the Catholic Church served an important social control mechanism, in other words, keeping people in their place. Now that the church was gone, so to speak, quote unquote, from politics, from power, they needed to substitute the Catholic Church with a new type of strategy or system to keep people in check, in other words. So the liberal regimes of the late 19th century in Latin America are beginning to build strong militaries to maintain social order in order to ensure modernization, in other words, okay? For example, the military is going to be used to quell rebellions, whenever there were rebellions, for example, but also to enforce the labor drafts, trying to push, for example, the peasants, the dispossessed indigenous populations into those public work projects by force, use coercion, and the like. And again, that was really the role of the new military in Latin America. Again, trying to replace the role of the church, in this case, by using coercion, in trying to maintain order, social order, in the region. Argentina is another country that is also moving towards a more liberal order, modernizing the economy. We see in 1868 the arrival of Domingo Sarmiento, for example, who in Buenos Aires, of course, the liberal elites were convinced that this is the only path moving forward. That really what plagued every Latin American country was a struggle between the forces of civilization and barbarism. They saw modernization as the process of trying to upgrade and civilize the country from the forces of barbarism, best characterized by the indigenous population, the mixed races, the poor, the gauchos, those cowboys that lived in the wild, again, that those represented barbarism, backwardness, for example, that what Argentina needed was to ignore the so-called barbarians and instead just pay attention to economic development, trying to modernize, for example, the cattle ranching industry in Argentina. They're trying to bring in new technologies, barbed wire, cattle grazing methods, for example, introduce from the United States, from Great Britain, for example, trying to fence properties and so on, and to do away with the gauchos altogether, or trying to push the gauchos into those new enterprises as a wage labor force. In other words, they're trying to do that because they're fighting what is called barbarism in this case. And they see that the only way to accomplish this was by inviting British financial assistance, that the British are going to bring in their expertise, their loans, they have capital, they can inject capital into Argentina so they can develop their cattle beef industry for the export of beef, but also leather as well. The British are also bringing, of course, their ships. They have their mercantile networks in place around the world. So they see them as an ally, in other words. So they're going to invite the British to start investing in Argentina. Now, what that required, of course, is to use also the state to coerce labor, to push people into the new enterprises, by different kinds of coercive methods. For example, they're going to rely on extending loans to the poor, the people that were dispossessed from their lands, for example, and to get them in debt, for them to pay off the debt. And the only way to pay back the debt was to be employed in any of the new enterprises that they were creating. This is what it's called debt peonage. Debt peonage, again, is a person that is indebted, acquire a certain debt. They were granted a loan by a merchant, a landowner, sometimes the state. And in order to pay back that debt, they needed to work for a landlord, in other words. And again, this is going to be an endless process. What the debt peon is going to find out is that they're going to be trapped in that system perpetually, unable to pay back the loan, in other words, because interest just keep accumulating on and on and on and on. Okay, that was one way to start really creating a kind of wage labor system by force. The other one was the criminalization of the gauchos. For example, they're going to introduce laws that prohibited people from carrying knives. The gauchos carry knives. They engage in knife fights as well. All of those activities that were known to be traditional for the gauchos are criminalized. So whenever a gaucho was thrown into prison, the only way that gaucho can get out of prison, to be bailed out, was by the gaucho to sign a labor contract to work for a cattle rancher for a wage. So that gaucho is losing his independence. He will no longer be a wild man, a nomad, working in the pampas, rounding out cattle, etc. He's going to be a wage earner now. Again, so they're using the state in order to start pushing people gradually more and more towards a wage labor economy. This is central, again, to a capitalist economy, earning wages. In Chile, we see something quite similar. It's really a country that is creating an export-based economy, commercializing its agriculture, trying to create a cash crop for exports like wheat, for example. But most importantly, Chile discovers huge deposits of nitrates. This is nitrogen. This is really used for fertilizer. And again, American farmers, European farmers are in great need of nitrates that are found in Chile. And now Chile is developing its nitrate industry. They're inviting the British to bring in capital to build railroads, roads, and bring in their ships in order to export this mineral or this fertilizer, to be more precise. And this is going to inject, of course, a new life into the Chilean economy. This is going to provide more and more capital for the state. And the state is going to use it for internal developments, for developing state banks, for example, to extend loans to merchants, to landowners, for the creation of enterprises and the like. So again, we see really the modernization of Latin America in the late 19th century. And of course, by the end of the 19th century, what we see is a new age of liberalism. In what way? Well, by the late 19th century, what we see is that Latin America is now not only led by liberal regimes that are pushing modernization, they're also led by regimes that are adopting a new philosophy coming directly from Europe, known as positivism. Again, this is a philosophy endorsed by Auguste Comte, for example, the sociologist, who developed this idea of the positivist ideology, which means that, again, you can solve all problems that arise in nature and that arise in human societies by using science. Again, the scientific method, in other words. That through science, we can solve all kinds of problems, political problems, social problems, we can solve economic problems. Again, we just need to give those issues to a set of experts, what we call scientists, in other words. So if the scientists are drafting policy, you can create a very cohesive and very efficient liberal state. You can modernize your country very efficiently if you only bring in the experts, in other words. And what the experts are saying, according to Comte, what the scientists is that the only way to achieve development, growth, prosperity, modernity is by creating, first and foremost, a climate of order. Again, an authoritarian, in other words, regime, that we need a strong hand. Somebody that will govern the country with an iron fist and that will maintain order. And out of order, you can actually develop an economy, in other words. Again, so this is going to resonate rather strongly in Latin America because the liberal regimes themselves were very authoritarian. They were using the state to push modernity at the expense of the lower classes. And by adopting the ideas of Comte, this idea of order, in other words, that in order to achieve progress, that you need to first and foremost create order, again, that was very appealing. And the best case study of this was the country of Mexico. Mexico is going to be the characterization, the incarnation of the positivist ideology in which this liberal caudillo, Porfirio Diaz, who seizes power in 1876 in Mexico and ruled the country until 1910, again, it's a 34-year dictatorship, brought in a series of advisors known as the científicos, the scientists, in other words, okay, the experts, in other words, the experts in the economy, the experts in politics, the experts in society, and so on. They're using scientific analysis, to solve problems and the like. He's going to create a climate of authoritarian rule in which he said, only with an iron fist can I really modernize Mexico. He created a rural police known as the rurales to really quell rebellions everywhere. All rebellions were quashed, again, by the rurales in order to maintain order in the countryside and pretty much force the process of modernization in Latin America. And for him, the only way out was to invite, of course, foreigners into the country to inject capital. In this case, the Americans. Again, creating an open door policy, inviting the Americans to bring in their capital. And this is exactly what happened. Again, during his regime, we're going to see American investors flooding Mexico, like the Guggenheim, for example, brothers, who had built a mining empire around the world. They're going to come in to build the mining industry to extract things like copper and silver out of Mexico, for example. Okay, so they're bringing capital and know-how, the technologies. The Morgan Bank is going to come in and bring in, of course, finance, loans for the development also of enterprises within Mexico and industries. Railroads like the Pennsylvania Railroad is going to be building the Mexican Railroad north through south in order to export the materials out of Mexico into the United States. And of course, also American oil companies will be developing the oil industry in Mexico as well. And again, so this really, again, becomes the kind of the incarnation of this new process of modernization. In Latin America, Mexico itself was characterized by this idea of order and progress. The authoritarian rule of Diaz, trying to modernize the country rather rapidly by ruling the country with an iron fist, and of course inviting foreign investors. The outcomes so far is that what we see is Latin America becoming more and more dependent on exports as they were trying to modernize. They're going to depend on exports. Most of the Latin American economies are based on exports, whether those were agricultural products or minerals or beef or leather, etc., cash crops. They're not really industrializing at this time. They're delaying their industrialization and mechanization of production precisely because they're relying on old methods of exploitation, like death peonage, for example, the labor drafts that we talked about. They're using, in other words, people to produce things when they can indeed bring in machinery. But they're not doing that because they have a steady supply of labor at their disposal. So they're not really mechanizing their economy at this point in the 19th century. And of course, the other thing is that, of course, we see the presence of foreign investors trying to help push the project of modernization in Latin America, whether those are British or American. Again, they're bringing their capital, their loans, and also their technologies in 19th century Latin America. So this is something that is occurring gradually. This is not a process that accelerated since the get-go in 1821 and 1824 with the independence movement, because there was a lot of instability, as I just explained, a lot of pushback by the conservatives. Now, part two is going to look at modernization in another region. In this case, we're going to look at modernization in Russia. So here, what we find is a region of Eastern Europe that is also going to modernize in their own way. Again, it follow a different path than other regions. Each region that we're going to be discussing, whether it's Latin America, Russia, and China, are following their own path to modernity. So here we're also going to be looking at an example of how a region that was at the same time, just like all the other regions of the world that were living in this old feudal past, were trying to dismantle the old feudal order and reform it and give rise to a new society. A society that will have at the core an economy geared towards productivity, what is called progress, what is called prosperity or growth. In simple terms, an economy based on development, in other words, economic development. Okay, so let us look at the modernization of Russia that is going to look at both economic development, but at the same time, the political reforms that attempted to also liberate the political order from the old monarchical system and trying to grant more and more rights and more say, more representation to the masses. Again, Russia, as we'll see, is going to a certain degree, accomplish the former, to a certain degree, what is called economic development. But when it came to the latter, political development, again, trying to liberalize the political system, this is going to be extremely, extremely difficult because of its feudal legacy centered on this highly centralized monarchical system in which the king was all-powerful and retain all the authority in his hands, of course. Okay, so this is going to be a quite different scenario. Now, before we look at modernization in Russia itself, let us look first and foremost at the old feudal legacy. Okay, the world as it was, in other words, okay, before modernization. So you can have a comparison of the kind of society, political institutions, economic organization of Russia before this process of modernity. Okay, so you'll be able to compare it and understand it. All right, so the region in question here, what we call Russia, started out around the 9th century when the Vikings, those were groups that came out of Scandinavia, moved into this region. By the way, the Vikings were also moving into places like, for example, the British Isles, northern France, and the like. Again, this is the nomadic invasions of the 9th and 10th centuries. Again, the Vikings, for example, raiding Europe. So some of those groups moved into Eastern Europe, and there they created a quote-unquote kingdom, the Grand Duchy of Kiev, for example. So it all started, again, here, as you see here in this map, in the Grand Duchy of Kiev. This is really the beginning stages of Russia, the early, very, very early origins of Russia. Again, the Duchy of Kiev. Now, of course, the leaders themselves were, the Vikings, while the masses were comprised of other ethnicities that were Slavic, for example. Okay, the masses were Slavic, while the rulers were Vikings in this case. Now, initially, this Grand Duchy of Kiev resembled the typical European state and society that was present at this time to the west of Kiev. For example, when we look, for example, at France, for example, okay, very similar. Okay, not a lot of distinction. In that, what we see is at the very top, a monarch. Here, of course, are dukes. In the Duchy of Kiev, of course, the title of the monarch is known as the duke. That's at the very top. Below the monarch, we will find wealthy landowners known as the boyars, for example. Okay. And to a certain degree, they, as we'll see, exercise significant power, in the society as well. This is a rural society in which the vast majority of the population are peasants. So this is also a society that consists, the vast majority, over 90% of the masses are peasants. And the peasants live in villages. And each village had a council, a governing council known as the mayor. The mayor is the village council that is not only in charge of governing the affairs of the peasants, but also controlling land, making sure that every member of the community has a certain lot to work on. In other words, they're engaging in land distribution and trying to make the system a little bit equitable, sort of, so to speak. In terms of the religion, however, the Duchy of Kiev follows the eastern branch of Christianity. This is the Orthodox branch, which is really different from the western branch of Christianity, which is the Roman Catholic. Okay? So, they are Christians, but they distinguish themselves from the Catholic Christians to the west. They associate more with the Greek version of Christianity, established in Constantinople, for example. And also, there's a certain quote-unquote liberal tradition present in the Duchy of Kiev, in that, again, this is not really a democracy. This is really, again, a monarchy, of course. But the boyars, the landed aristocracy, the landowners, in this case, exercise a certain degree of authority and independence as well. They share some power, in other words, with the dukes, with the monarchs on top. They are sometimes assembled from time to time, and they have meetings, and there are negotiations between the boyars and the dukes, and they engage in deals, for example. At least this is how it all started. Now, things didn't stay that way, because at some point there will be significant disruption taking place in Eastern Europe and the Duchy of Kiev. Okay, and that happened in 1222, when there was an invasion coming from the east, in this case the Mongols. This is the Mongol invasion of Eurasia. The Mongols poured down from northern China. They invaded China, took over China, and from there they started expanding across Eurasia. Eventually they started to topple different kingdoms, particularly in the Middle East and also in Eastern Europe. And the Duchy of Kiev was precisely one of those kingdoms that was subdued by the Mongols. The Mongols also took control of another urban center known as Moscow. Moscow started out as a certain, urban center that did not really have any significant authority, so to speak, as Kiev did. But nonetheless, those two polities, those two political entities in Eastern Europe that were really the forerunners of what was to be Russia later on, are now under the control of the Mongols. Okay? Now, in 1328, however, Moscow, which really started out, as I mentioned, as an urban center, was growing territorially. It was growing in terms of population as well. And it is now attaining a new status, the status of a duchy as well. They're ruled now by a monarch. So this is now another power center. Although it is still controlled by the Mongols, they are paying tribute to the Mongols. The Duchy of Moscow is now growing in political power as well. They are making deals with the Mongols to retain a certain degree of independence, only if they pay tribute to their overlords, for example. So the ascendancy of Moscow in Eastern Europe is also going to lead to other changes, and that is that the peasantry here in Eastern Europe is going to remain now in a new status. They're going to fall into a new status, and they're going to remain there really for centuries. And that is that the peasants themselves are now making deals with their own landlords to receive protection from them, from the Mongols. And what is the deal about? Well, many of the peasants are willing to give up their labor to become serfs to a landlord, as long as the landlord protects them from the Mongols as well. Again, so what we see is that more than 50% of the peasantry, whether it's in Kiev or in Moscow, are moving into a new status of serfdom. And really, again, a serf was really a kind of slave. It was the closest we can get in Europe to what later on we know in world history as a slave, for example. The only difference is that slaves could be sold by individuals, as the individual property of a person or so. So once again, slaves could be sold as individuals in private markets or in public auctions and so on and so on. Whereas a serf here in Eastern Europe could not be separated from the state in which that person worked. It was part of the property of the state. So when a landlord sold his own estate to another landlord, he had to also at the same time sell the serfs that were working the land. They couldn't be separated. But in every other regard, they were indeed virtual slaves themselves, the serfs, that is to say. So again, this is a part of this new change that is taking place in Eastern Europe. What we see is, that the Russian peasants are now, the vast majority of them are now falling into this new status, again, a serfdom. Okay? So by 1480, however, with the downfall of the Mongols, this new polity, Moscow, is now rising up in prominence. What we see is that this polity, which really started as an urban center, and now it becomes a duchy, again, is really governed by a duke or a monarch. By 1480, it starts to exert significant dominance over that region. And they're on its way to start really building, slowly but surely, an empire. Again, so Moscow will become really the kind of capital, if you will, of an emergent imperial system. It's really barely rising up in 1480. And this is, again, due to the fact that in 1480, Moscow was ruled by a monarch, Ivan III, for example, who had himself imperial aspirations. He really wants expansion, territorial expansion, and he really declared Moscow to be the third Rome. Again, it was very significant, a very symbolic statement, to say the least. What that actually meant is that, from this point onwards in Europe, there are three major power centers. He's really, using Christianity as a symbol of power. Okay, meaning that, with the birth of Christianity in the past, there were two major power centers in the past, and one was in Rome itself, in Italy. Again, the birth of the Christian Church, the Catholic Church there, in the 4th century, and then the split of the Catholic Church, the split of the Christian Church, with the creation of a second power center in Constantinople, in the eastern wing of the Roman Empire. But now he declares that there is a third power center, and that will be Moscow. That this is going to be yet another sphere of influence, not only for Christianity, but also for European power politics as well. Again, so this is not just a religious center, this is also an imperial center. So this is really an announcement that Moscow is about to start building really an empire. Again, and one of the very first provinces that they look at in terms of trying to incorporate those provinces into the emergent Russian Empire was Poland and Lithuania to the west. Again, so this is leading to the conquest of the Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland by the new monarchs of Moscow. And again, this is leading to a massive territorial expansion. Now we see the building of an empire, in other words. And this really becomes the mission of the new Russian state centered on Moscow. And that is to expand and control new territory. So this is the grand vision of the future that the monarchs have for the new emergent empire. Okay, that again, the empire must expand continuously and control new territories in order to extract resources, but most importantly, tribute. Their vision is also centered on a kind of paternalistic idea. Again, this is the feudal order in which the strong man, in this case the monarch, is like a father figure that is trying to create order and stability among the conquered populations and the like. So this is a very paternalistic idea that the Russian leaders have of themselves. This is a self-image that they're promoting as well. But again, this is going to be the motto of the Russian Empire, that the Russian Empire must continue to expand if it were to survive. Because if it will stop expanding and controlling new lands and territories, then this can lead to the fall of the empire. This is their ideology. In other words, their imperial ideology. Okay? Keep that in mind, because this is going to be very, very useful for understanding, Russia later on as we're moving into the 19th and 20th centuries particularly. Okay? Now, in the 1600s, this emerging empire is developing, of course, its own agricultural system that is going to support its entire economy. They are indeed building an imperial economy based entirely on agriculture, but most importantly, this is an economy based on commercial agriculture. Why? Well, because what we see in Western Europe is the recovery of the European population from the ravage of the Black Death. We talked about the Black Death in the past. This is the plague that came into the 14th century in Europe, decimated about 50% of the population of Europe. That really, created a catastrophe of sorts in Europe. It created a series of changes. The downfall of the Catholic Church was one. The downfall of feudalism was another, bringing in capitalism as well. Again, so there was a great reduction of population from 75 million down to perhaps 30 35 million people were left. But by the 1600s, we see a rebound. The population of Europe is now recovering, okay? And there's now population growth. So what that means is that there's more people to feed. Again, in the towns, let us just say, in the Iberian Peninsula, in France, Central Europe, what today is Germany, for example, and the like. Again, the population is increasing. There's a need for food. And so here, the Russian leadership, the monarchs, see a new commercial opportunity to make money, in other words, to bring in resources, in other words, by exporting food into Western Europe. Again, so they are commercializing agriculture. They are turning agriculture from a subsistence practice of people just growing grain to sustain themselves to start really now trying to grow cash crops, food products, grains for the Western markets. Again, because there's a great demand for that, of course. Now, what this required, however, was the use of a labor system that will be steady and reliable. Keep that in mind. Again, it's not just enough to say we're moving towards commercial agriculture, so we're going to have now commercial farms and we're going to engage in massive, production of crops, because ultimately, before the era of mechanization, before the era of industry, you need labor. Who's going to work the land, in other words. So here, what we see is a major change in Russian history, in that the Tsars, thus the title now given to the monarchs of Russia, Tsars, which means emperor, the Russian Tsars, what they're doing is trying to secure that labor by using repressive mechanisms, something we saw similarly again in Latin America. Very, very similar. It's a similar process. The state comes in and tries to secure labor by using the power of the state to keep people in a system of labor of exploitation. And so in 1649, the Russian Tsars passed a law that was called the Legal Code of 1649. And what they're doing here is that although serfs were already present in Russia, what the Russian Tsars are doing is that they're legalizing the status of the serf. In other words, they're making it a legal institution. The Legal Code of 1649, saying those individuals that are enserfed at this point, they were to remain serfs. Again, this is going to be a perpetual condition that is going to be inherited from generation to generation, in other words. Okay, so there's no possibility of emancipation, in other words. So what the Tsars are doing here is trying to simply secure the labor, trying to freeze, in other words, Russia in the traditional forms of exploitation as they're moving towards the market. So this is the gradual movement of Russia towards a market economy, trying to grow, once again, cash crops for exports. This can be considered as one of the initial stepping stones towards modernity, although the methods of labor are still highly trapped in the past, in the feudal past. Now, the Russian state, by the 1600s onwards, are going to increase manifold. Okay? They are indeed trying to create a more efficient economic system. Remember, this is the time when, in Europe, particularly Western Europe, mainly England, for example, was going through a commercial revolution, mercantilism, the rise of trading companies, for example, overseas trade, again, trying to create a more effective economy for achieving what is called development, for example. So the Russian state is looking at this development taking place in the West, and they're also trying to imitate some aspects of that. Again, not everything, but certain aspects of that they're trying to imitate. For example, they believe that in order to push Russia forward economically, that they needed to expand the powers of the state, okay? Trying to enforce serfdom, again, trying to keep people, for example, in those landed estates to be working in those commercial enterprises, growing grain for the market. And in that way, they were reasserting absolutism as well. They were indeed the protectors of the system, in other words. They were indeed in charge of the economy. Now the emperors, the Tsar, in other words, they are seen as the absolute ruler who is in total control of the empire and is now seizing the reins of the economy. Again, so they're pretty much seizing control of every aspect of the economy. The entire economy will fall under the control of the Tsar, in other words, and his regime, his administration. They're taking control of not only agriculture and trying to enforce serfdom, but also they're taking control of mines, for example, commercial estates, and also workshops as well. So they are directing this process, the process of modernization. Now, this was not really coined modernization. In the 1600s, they were just simply trying to imitate what was really taking place in the West, something that later on became known or termed modernization. So let us just be clear that at this point, Russia is not really thinking in terms of modernity, but they are trying to get the economy to be more productive, more efficient. In other words, to produce more and more revenues for the state. So in this process, again, what they're actually doing is they're initiating, this process of modernization. Okay, so we are going to actually make a stop here. We're going to leave the rest of this discussion for session 3. We're going to continue covering modernization in Russia. After we cover that, it's going to take us about 20 minutes or so. We're going to be moving into China. We're going to spend the rest of session 3 looking at modernization in China and then provide pretty much an overview of this topic, when we return. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session 3 when we come back. Thank you.